Corinna Ashdale didn't cry when her husband handed her the divorce papers. She didn't beg. She didn't ask why, even though she already knew. She just looked at the papers, then looked at him and asked the only question that seemed worth asking. Did you tell your mother first, or did she tell you? Stellan Ashdale, 41, partner at a mid-sized architecture firm, and the man Corinna had been married to for 11 years, didn't answer that question. He straightened his tie instead. That was the answer. The morning it happened, Corinna Ashdale was already awake before 5. She had a habit of waking before the house did, before the coffee maker clicked on, before the light turned from black to grey over the back garden. She had a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen island and thought about the Callaway Renwick project, because that was what she did. She thought about work. She thought about structures, about load-bearing walls, about the way light moved through a building in the late afternoon. She did not think about her husband, because by then, thinking about him had become something that required effort she didn't have. Corinna Vane Ashdale was 38 years old at the time. She had been the founding principal of her own structural engineering consultancy, Vane & Associates, for 6 years. She had 41 employees. She had offices in Chicago and one in Nashville that they'd opened the previous spring. She had a reputation in the industry that had taken 15 years to build and that she protected with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything. She was not by any measure a woman who needed anything from Stellan Ashdale. But she had loved him once, that part was true. And she had spent the better part of 11 years organizing her life around his, the way you do when you love someone. Accommodating his schedule, hosting dinners for his clients, keeping her own name hyphenated at his mother's insistence even though it never sat right with her. Keeping the peace because peace seemed worth keeping. It wasn't. The divorce papers appeared on a Tuesday. Stellan brought them home in a manila folder, which struck Corinna later as a very deliberate choice. Not a briefcase, not tucked into a bag. A folder held in front of him like a prop. He set them on the kitchen island, the same island where she'd had her tea that morning, and slid them toward her. I think we both know this hasn't been working, he said. Corinna looked at the folder. She looked at the red wax seal pressed into the corner, which confused her briefly until she realized it was just a sticker. Since when? She asked. For a long time, he said. She opened the folder and read the first page. She was a careful reader. She didn't skim. Stellan stood on the other side of the island and watched her, and at one point, he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and she noticed, because she noticed everything. Your mother's attorney drafted these, she said. My attorney drafted these. Philip Grantham drafted these. He's been your mother's attorney for 30 years. She turned to page 3. Did you tell your mother first, or did she tell you? The silence stretched long enough to answer the question. Corinna set the folder down. She didn't close it. She just set it down and looked at the man she had been married to for 11 years and felt something she could describe later as clarity. The kind that comes not from understanding something new, but from finally acknowledging something you've known for a long time. Who is she? Corinna asked. Stellan's jaw tightened. That's not what this is about. I didn't ask what this was about, I asked who she is. He didn't answer. But the way he didn't answer told her everything she needed to know about how long this had been going on. Her name, Corinna learned later, was Ingrid Solberg Marsh, 29, an interior designer who had worked on the Hartwell Hotel renovation the previous year. The same project that had kept Stellan working late 3 nights a week for 7 months. Corinna had sent him dinner twice. She had asked the caterer to include a note. She had been, as she had always been, considerate. Patient good. The word she kept coming back to was good. She had spent 11 years being good, and she was beginning to understand that good, in the context of her marriage, had functioned less as a virtue and more as a strategy of containment. Keep the wife good. Keep her manageable. Keep her grateful. She had not been grateful. She had been busy. There is a difference. Stellan's mother, Marguerite Ashdale, 68, a former city council member who had opinions about everything and stated them in the tone of someone used to being obeyed, had never liked Corinna. This was not a secret. Marguerite had wanted Stellan to marry someone named Ingrid Solberg Marsh, except she hadn't known that name at the time. She had wanted, more specifically, someone who would be content to be Mrs. Ashdale, someone who would tend the marriage like a garden, someone whose identity did not have a letterhead. Corinna had a letterhead. She had 2 offices. She had a business that generated more revenue in a quarter than Stellan's firm generated in a year. Marguerite had known this and had resented it with the particular precision of a woman who has spent her life measuring other women's worth against their usefulness to the men in her family. She had raised her son to believe the same thing, even if she'd done it quietly, even if the lesson had been delivered in small ways over many years. The offhand comments about Corinna's hours, The questions about when they planned to have children, the way Marguerite referred to Stellan's career as his career and Corinna's as her little company. Little. She always said little. The divorce filing became public knowledge in the way these things do. Through mutual friends, through professional circles, through the particular velocity of bad news in a city where everyone knows someone who knows someone. Corinna did not talk about it. She went to work. She had a structural assessment due on the Callaway Renwick building by the end of the month, and 3 junior engineers who needed her review on load calculations before Thursday. She had the Nashville office's first major hospital project entering its critical phase. She had, in other words, a life, an actual substantial load-bearing life, and she let it hold her. What she did not do was hire a lawyer immediately. That surprised people later. Her colleagues expected her to fight, to counterfile, to come out swinging. Her assistant Delia, who had been with her since the beginning and who had once, memorably, told a difficult client to find someone who cares, assumed Corinna was planning something. She was. She just wasn't planning what people expected. The Ashdale architecture firm, formerly Ashdale and Renwick, though Graham Renwick had retired 5 years ago and the name had never quite been updated, had been in the Ashdale family for 2 generations. Stellan's father had founded it. Stellan had inherited both the firm and the aesthetic sensibility his mother had always considered his most qualifying characteristic for success. The firm did good work. Mid-range projects, institutional clients, the occasional private residence for families who wanted something with character. What the firm did not do for the last several years was turn a consistent profit. Corinna knew this because Stellan had told her, in a rare moment of candor, 3 years into their marriage. She had listened carefully, asked several questions, and then, because she was the kind of person who, when presented with a problem, looked for solutions, quietly begun to explore whether there was a path forward. She hadn't told Stellan what she was exploring. He had seemed embarrassed by the conversation, and she had read that embarrassment as a signal to approach the topic carefully. She had approached it very carefully over a long period of time, in ways that weren't visible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. No one in the Ashdale family had been paying close attention. The company that had been quietly acquiring Ashdale and Renwick's outstanding debts and underperforming project contracts over the past 14 months was called Vantorp Capital Partners. Vantorp Capital Partners had offices in Chicago. Vantorp Capital Partners had no public-facing website to speak of. A deliberate choice made by the company's principal, who had very specific ideas about the relationship between visibility and leverage. Vantorp Capital Partners was, in every legal and financial sense of the word, Corinna Vane Ashdale's company, not Vane and Associates. This was a different vehicle entirely. A holding company she had established through a trust structure 6 years earlier, before the consultancy had grown into what it became, when she had first understood that there were multiple ways to build things and that the most durable structures were the ones people didn't see until they were already supporting the weight. She had not told Stellan. She had not told anyone. The trust was airtight. The acquisition had been handled through a series of intermediary transactions that were entirely legal, entirely documented, and entirely invisible to anyone who didn't already know where to look. She had known for 8 months that Ashdale and Renwick was hers. She had also known for about the same length of time that Stellan had been seeing someone. She had said nothing, because she was thinking. Corinna Vane Ashdale was always thinking. The meeting that ended everything happened at the Ashdale architecture firm offices on a Thursday morning in March. Stellan had called the meeting to discuss what he was describing to his remaining partners as a partnership transition. His language for the acquisition he was still trying to negotiate as though he had leverage. He had 2 junior partners, a senior project manager named Weston, who had been with the firm for 9 years and who had recently begun interviewing elsewhere, and Marguerite, who had no formal role but attended anyway, seated in the corner of the conference room with the particular posture of a woman who considers herself the source of all relevant authority. Ingrid Solberg-Marsh was not at the meeting, but everyone in the room knew who she was. The representative from Vantorp Capital Partners was a woman named Sloane Devereux, 44, who had worked with Corinna for 5 years and who had the specific skill of walking into a room and giving nothing away until she chose to give it. She arrived 3 minutes early. She brought 1 folder. She did not bring coffee. Stellan had met her once before, briefly, at the preliminary meeting 6 weeks earlier, and had formed the impression that Vantorp was a mid-sized holding company looking to add a legacy architecture firm to their portfolio. He had formed this impression because it was what he had wanted to believe, and because Sloane had said nothing to contradict it. The meeting began. Sloane set the folder on the table and outlined, with very pleasant efficiency, the current state of Ashdale and Renwick's outstanding obligations. The numbers were correct. The timeline was correct. The proposed acquisition structure was, she noted, favorable to all parties with vested interests in the firm's continuity. Marguerite spoke first. She had opinions about the proposed terms and stated them in the order she considered most important, beginning with the firm's name and ending with the question of board composition. She expected, based on 6 decades of experience with rooms like this, that her opinions would be acknowledged, considered, and ultimately accommodated. Sloane listened with genuine attention. Then she opened the folder to the page that mattered and slid it across the table. "These are the revised terms," she said. "They've been approved by the principal." Stellan looked at the page. He looked at it for a long moment. "The principal," he said. "We've been corresponding with a name. Vanthorpe is it's listed as a trust entity. Who is the actual?" The door to the conference room opened. Corinna walked in, wearing a dark coat. Her hair pulled back the way she wore it on days when she had back-to-back site visits, a messenger bag over one shoulder because she'd come from a morning meeting at the Callaway Renwick building. She looked like herself, exactly like herself, which in retrospect was the most disorienting thing about it. She set her bag on a chair near the wall, not at the head of the table, not in a position that announced anything. She sat. She looked at the folder Sloane had brought, and then she looked at her husband. "Stellan," she said. The silence in the room lasted long enough that Weston, the senior project manager, looked at the door as though he was calculating the distance. Marguerite Ashdale stood up. She was not a tall woman, but she had the posture of someone who had never needed height, and she looked at Corinna with an expression that had been in development for 11 years. "By what right?" Marguerite said, slowly and precisely. "Are you here?" Corinna turned and looked at her mother-in-law. Not for a long time, just long enough to let the question sit. "Ownership," she said. It took Stellan 20 minutes to understand what he was being told. That was, in its own way, the most painful part, not because Corinna felt vindicated by his confusion, but because the confusion itself was so complete. He kept asking questions that assumed the situation was something other than what it was. He kept looking for the edge of it, the negotiable part, the place where this would turn into something he could manage. There was no edge. The acquisition was complete. The trust had been established before the marriage, which meant the assets were entirely separate from the marital estate. Stellan's attorney, Philip Grantham, who had been Marguerite's attorney for 30 years and who had, it turned out, failed to investigate the acquiring party with anything close to due diligence, sat very still for most of this conversation. "You knew," Stellan said finally. Not a question, a statement he was still testing. "I've known for 8 months that the firm was in default on 3 of its primary debt instruments," Corinna said. "I've known for 14 months that the ownership structure was vulnerable. And I've known for considerably longer than that the firm needed a path forward that it wasn't going to find on its own." "You did this." He stopped. He started again. "You did this on purpose." "I built a holding company that acquired distressed assets," she said. "Your firm qualified." "Yes. Why?" It was the first time he'd asked her a real question in longer than she could remember, and she took it seriously. "Because I thought there might still be something worth saving," she said. "And then you handed me divorce papers in a folder with a wax sticker on it, so." Marguerite Ashdale remained in her chair for the duration of the meeting and said very little after the initial exchange. This was, by the accounts of everyone present, deeply out of character. Weston later described it as watching a building lose its structural integrity in real time, not collapsing, but visibly, unmistakably, no longer holding the weight it had claimed to hold. The terms Sloane laid out were fair. Everyone agreed on that later, including Stellan's actual attorney, who had been called and arrived 40 minutes into the meeting looking slightly out of breath. The firm could continue operating under its current name. The junior partners retained their equity. Weston's employment was protected. The existing project commitments would be honored. What changed was the ownership structure. What changed was who held the debt. What changed was the quiet fact, which would not be announced publicly, but which everyone in the room now understood, that Ashdale and Renwick, the firm Marguerite had built her identity around, the firm she had spent 11 years reminding Corinna was her son's legacy, now operated under a holding company that belonged to the woman she had treated like a temporary inconvenience. Marguerite left before the meeting concluded. She did not say goodbye to Corinna. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Corinna did not contest the terms. The marital estate was divided cleanly. The house went to Stellan, which was what he wanted, and which Corinna had never particularly loved. The art went with each respective purchaser. The joint accounts were split without drama. Corinna's own assets were her own, as they had always been, as they had been established to be long before any of this happened. She moved into a rental apartment in the West Loop while she looked for something permanent. The apartment had high ceilings and good light in the afternoon, and a kitchen that was smaller than she needed, but that she used almost every morning. She cooked breakfast. She made coffee in a French press. She went to work. Vane and Associates closed on a contract for a mixed-use development on the south side in October. The Nashville office brought on 2 new engineers. Delia negotiated a better rate with their preferred structural testing lab and sent Corinna a 3-line email about it that ended with a small drawing of a person flexing. Corinna taped it to her monitor. What she thought about, in the quiet months after everything was settled, was not what she had lost, but what she had spent 11 years not quite looking at directly. The way she had shaped herself around someone else's comfort without ever being asked to. The meetings she'd skipped to attend his client dinners. The conversations she'd avoided to keep the peace. The ambition she'd expressed quietly, sideways, so as not to disturb something she no longer remembered the shape of. She had been protecting a version of her marriage that had not actually existed. That was the thing that was hard to look at, not the betrayal itself, but the years of good faith she had extended towards something that had been hollow for a long time. You can know something and not know it at the same time. That is, it turns out, one of the more ordinary human experiences, more ordinary than most people admit. Ingrid Solberg-Marsh and Stellan lasted 8 months after the divorce before things, by all accounts, became complicated. Corinna heard this the way she heard most things about her former marriage, second-hand, without surprise, without satisfaction. Marguerite Ashdale made no contact. That was expected. What was less expected was the letter from Weston, the senior project manager, sent on Ashdale and Renwick letterhead. The new Ashdale and Renwick, the one under Vantorp's structure, the one Corinna technically owned. He'd been with the firm for 9 years. He was applying formally for the role of managing principal under the new ownership arrangement. He had attached a 5-year plan. The plan was good. The projections were defensible. His understanding of the firm's existing relationships was thorough. She forwarded it to Sloane with a note that said, "Schedule a call. There is a kind of power that announces itself early and loudly, that enters rooms first and exits last, and makes sure everyone in the room knows exactly what kind of power it is." Marguerite Ashdale understood this kind. She had practiced it for decades. It had worked, more or less, for most of her life. And then there is the kind of power that builds slowly, that establishes itself in structures no one thinks to examine, that is patient in the way that only people with a real sense of purpose can be patient. Not waiting, exactly, but working towards something while the room looks elsewhere. Corinna Vane Ashdale understood this kind. She had understood it for years. She had learned it from working in an industry where being underestimated was essentially built into the job description, where being quiet and precise and thorough in a room full of loud and imprecise people was not a disadvantage if you knew how to let the room spend itself first. She had learned that people who believe they hold the power rarely check the load-bearing walls. They don't think to. That is the nature of certainty. It stops asking questions. She had let Stellan be certain. She had let Marguerite be certain. She had done her work in the meantime. The day she signed the final paperwork on her new apartment, a full-floor unit in a building she'd always liked, the kind with good bones and windows that faced east, she arrived early. The building's structural certification was a Vane & Associates job from 4 years back. She knew every wall in it. She stood at the window and watched the city come into the light. She was not happy in the way you're supposed to be happy after a story like this. She was not triumphant. She was something quieter and more durable than either of those things. She had built something that lasted. She had known what it was worth even when no one around her thought to ask. That, she had decided, was enough, more than enough. It always had been.